Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic is South Ponders North, a chat between Mexico and Alaska. Today's presenters are our Guide Development Director and Expedition Leader, Annie Van Dinther, and our Expedition Leader, Sofia Merino. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it right over to you. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Sunny, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you who showed up. This is not my regular day to present. I'm usually here on Thursday, but for a variety of reasons, we're switching it up this week. I'm super excited about this talk, and I'm super excited that Sofia is here to join me. She and I have been guiding together for quite a few years now, and we just get along wonderfully. So we can have all kinds of conversations with each other, and we often ask each other about the places that we live and what it's like to be there. Today, I'm getting out of the hot seat. I will not be driving. Sofia is going to drive, and I guess I'm back into the hot seat as far as interview goes because she's going to be asking me questions. Sofia, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this beautiful Friday. I'm here in Mexico, actually, so this chat is literally between Mexico and Alaska right now, so that's perfect. And we want to start right off the edge. As we were talking about this, the places that we live and how different they are. It always happens, at least on my side in Mexico, that we have some assumptions, and those are perfect, So as I was chatting with Annie, I was like, okay, Annie, what is the most common question that you have when you tell everybody, I am from Alaska?
Okay, so first we've got these mosquitoes here. That's a big one. People want to know if we really are in this thick sort of fog of bugs all the time. In some places in Alaska, that's true, but not always. But then there's a whole variety of questions that we get. And some of these questions even came from your family members, yes?
Yes, exactly. So when we were talking about this, I was asking my nephews, I was asking my mom, my dad, like, okay, if you have someone from Alaska right in front of you, what would be the questions that you ask them? And we're coming from such different places, we've never been to Alaska. We've never been that far north. So I think these are pretty basic questions, but things that we've always wanted to ask someone. So for example, one that I really liked and is like, is it always cold? Right, Annie?
Yes. And so we're going to get into all of these sort of questions that you might have about Alaska. And the first one I will say that my kids experience when they go to camp in Michigan, which is where I'm originally from, is, do you live in an igloo? And the answer to that, you can see my walls behind me, are that no, not all Alaskans at all live in igloos. This is a traditional dwelling for some Inuit groups in the far north, and even Inuits, most of them these days, of course, also do not live in igloos. So we'll get rid of that one off the front here. The bugs, the insects. Here's a little secret about Homer, Alaska. I don't want you to tell everybody. We don't even have screens on our windows. So where I live in Alaska, we do not have a lot of insects. I mean, they're here, and certainly if you go to a swampy area in the evening, you're going to find them. But in Denali and the far north, yes, you might find yourself dressed like this if you were to do some kind of outdoor studies.
Okay.
Okay, so here's one I get. As people fly this way, they see the vast wilderness that is Alaska. And there are populated places, there are cities, there are malls, there are all those kinds of things. So it's not all this remote, rugged terrain. There's certainly a lot more here than there are in other places. The vistas and the landscape, again, a question we get. Yes, we have these beautiful, this is a high mountain glacial lake that I took this photo from a plane. We have those, and float planes, right? Lots of those, more pilots here than any other state. But it doesn't all look like this.
Yes, so again, for me, I'm coming from a warm place. I love hot weather. Here in Baja, we have perfect weather. We're actually coming out of summer and it's amazing. It's beautiful. In winter, for me, I'm freezing, but I'm just using a light jacket. So when I was asking this, to my family, what kind of questions they want to ask. One that my mom actually asked, it was like, because she doesn't like cold weather. So my mom was like, do you always have to be like with a bunch of layers, or how is that?
Okay, so my answer is yes and no. Yes, in a way, I think if you were to come here, you would say, Annie, I'm dressing in a bunch of layers.
It's cold for me.
You're cold, exactly. So one answer is yes. This is actually a picture from Churchill from Northern Lights season, which is much colder than where I live in Alaska. And we're going to get into these regions of Alaska because it is a very big place. And so where I live, I kind of like to say that I wear the same clothes outside in the winter as I do in the summer. Windbreaker. It's a little bit like Baja, honestly, when we're on the water, if it's a cold day. A windbreaker, a fleece, maybe a vest, and then another layer, and maybe even long underwear or leggings or something, right? Underneath your wind pants or rain pants. It's the duration of time that changes. Okay. And how long you want to spend out in that, and then what you're doing in that weather. But certainly if you go up north, yeah, parkas and boots, it's the way to go.
Okay. And also, like, one of the most common questions that I was getting, it was about bears. I think at least here is like, okay, if I'm going to Alaska, I'm going to see bears. So yes, no, what's going on with this bear?
Okay, so this picture was taken actually on a trip that our wonderful host Sunny was on with me at the Grizzly Boat. And yes, we see bears and we're close to them there. We do have bears in town, just on the Homer communication, little Facebook thing. We talk about that. We'll talk about the animals more later, but certainly there are bears around us, but it's not like we're seeing them every day when we leave our front door. I mean, really, all of these animals are so sort of quintessential and telling the story. I would say if I would put one at the central part there of what is most important to Alaska, it would actually be the salmon. But yes, these animals are part of our life, but maybe not quite like people imagine.
Okay. And I mean, we're going to go a little bit more, in detail about the wildlife, of course. That's something that we're very interested in. But like, before that, it's, I think, very important to just realize, where are we, where is this coming from? So I'm down here in La Paz, in the southern part of Baja, and you are all the way up north, right? Around let me move this, right here, yes. So are we that far? I was wondering that. And then I looked it up actually, and I was like, okay, if I were to drive from Baja, from La Paz, where I am right now, to Homer, it would take me around 84 hours. So I was like, okay, this is a little bit far. So for me, that was quite impressive, because I think most of the time now with planes, we can just take a plane and it's so easy. But no, we are pretty far, and that comes with more information about it. So what can you tell us about your state, about Alaska, where you live?
So it's a little bit deceiving looking at maps sometimes. And I think one of the biggest things that makes that distance as big as it is that Alaska itself is huge. We are an incredibly large state, 1/5 the size of all of the lower 48, twice the size of Texas. We are 1,400 miles from sort of in length and 2,700 miles wide. So it's a gigantic place. A lot of that driving that you need to do to get here would actually be in the state of Alaska, not to mention California, Oregon, Mexico, and British Columbia that you would need to get through. So part of it is the huge expanse of our state. There's about 600 and some thousand square miles and only 700,000 people. So we almost have about a square mile per person in terms of the population density. But as we'll find out, we're a little bit more condensed than that.
So if I go then to the state, I know that it must be different, the north from the south, the east from the west, depending where you are. So how do you divide Alaska?
So that's a great question, because really we do need to think about this almost as 5 different states. And one of the things that could be very interesting for people to look up is the European countries that would fit into Alaska if they were laid out, or the states that would fit in. For you, the Mexican states that would fit in to Alaska. And you realize how big it is when you see all of them sort of overlaid on the map. As far as these regions go, we'll talk about the Arctic first. The Arctic is probably what a lot of people think of when they think of Alaska or the North, right? Much longer winters, before climate change, ice throughout the year onto the coast there, polar bears living there, different Inuit groups and villages along the coast. This is from Kaktovik, which is along the Arctic Ocean, and there's polar bears there. So this long expanse also of the land that is treeless. The word tundra literally means treeless. And that high north area is that. Also, it would be related to permafrost. So where is the permafrost in the state? Certainly up there in the high Arctic, they're going to have permafrost. So how you build things is going to be affected, gardening, all of those sorts of things. The next region, and one that we visit on our ultimate Alaska trip, would be what we call the interior. Sometime we could do a whole webinar on the vocab of Alaska. Interior is something that is commonly, we talk about that here, right? Like she went to the interior would be a common thing to hear someone say. The interior is cold in the winter months, and it's quite hot, like up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer months. It doesn't have the ocean that's sort of regulating the temperature the way that the other areas of Alaska have in them. Some of our guests have been to Fairbanks. This is going to be an area that is very sort of quintessential boreal forest, which is a really beautiful ecosystem. Lots of mountains, not that many people, other than Fairbanks is a pretty decent size. So that's what I think of when I think of the interior of Alaska. Many dry cabins, meaning cabins without, running water, that kind of thing. Okay. The next one that we'll talk about, and honestly, we're not going to spend much time on the West Coast. So the West Coast, beautiful and incredibly rugged remote area of Alaska. Someday I will get there. I've been to some of the remote, most southern parts of it, but that's kind of a whole different beast in terms of remoteness. We're going to move now to South Central, which is where I live. And South Central is really, it's the populated place. Anchorage, yep, she's pointing right there to where Kachemak Bay is in Homer. Anchorage, almost half of the population of our state lives in Anchorage, which is South Central. And we'll see in this next picture here that in many ways, South Central is, here's the beautiful city of Anchorage, where again, there's malls, there's movie theaters, there's all the trappings of, modern life. We drive up there to get to places like Costco or to buy some things. We don't have furniture stores where I live, or we don't have big box stores where I live. So sometimes there's a lot of people moving through Anchorage for those kinds of reasons. It's also known for some other things. This is a great story. Some people might even remember this who are listening. This magazine still exists, but I think it used to be much more popular. And it was called Alaska Men Magazine. What this does is it literally has photos of like bachelors from Alaska. I think at one point we had a 4-to-1 ratio of men to women. And so this idea of like, how do you find a wife when that's the ratio? And I have a friend, Richard, who lives here in Homer, and he met his wife this way. She was a real estate agent from California. She saw the Alaska Men magazine. He was, I don't know if he was on the cover or if he was in it. We tried to find that exact copy, but we couldn't find it. And she wrote him a letter based on that article, and she moved up here. And there's, I don't know the number of women who have moved to Alaska from this, but it would be very interesting to ask Susie, the publisher, how many women has she matched with these tough Alaskan bachelors? And then moose. South Central is just chock full of moose. We'll talk more about how they make it through the winter, but certainly in Alaska, in Anchorage, in this big city where you see these big buildings, it's not uncommon to see moose just hanging about. So the oddities of Alaska. They say the goods are odd, but the odds are good. I think that's how it goes.
That's very interesting. I was not expecting like there was a magazine about Alaska men. So I learned quite a few new things, and this is, I think, top-notch information.
What did you say? It's the Tinder of the 80s?
Yeah, it's the Tinder of the 80s, which I think is more romantic. You know, you write a letter to someone,
Yes.
and so that's nice.
Definitely.
Anyways, what about this other region of Alaska?
Sure. So Southeast is a lot of people, when they hear about cruises that go to Alaska, many of them just go into what we refer to as the Inside Passage or the Southeast. Our state capital, Juneau, is in Alaska. You can see it there right between the word coast and mountains. We're the only place that has a capital that is on an island. So you cannot drive to our capital. And if you think about civic opportunity, that does create some issues, because you are talking about, somebody has to have enough money to take a boat or a plane in order to represent themselves there in Juneau. So there's been talks over the years about whether we should move our capital, but it remains where it historically was started. This region, from an ecosystem picture, is really rainforest. It's called temperate rainforest, which you can also find a little bit of temperate rainforest in Argentina. You can find some in Japan. Almost all of British Columbia is temperate rainforest. And then Southeast Alaska. It's this wet, mossy kind of forest. It's one of my favorite forests in the whole world. You can often hear ravens making those really cool drip noises. And you better bring your rain gear, because it is, I think it's 80 inches a year is the beginning of what you have to get to be a temperate rainforest. So it's wet.
Wow.
That's for sure.
Okay, so also something that I was very surprised when we were, talking about the big differences of being in Alaska, and things that I've heard always is that either you have a lot of light or you have a lot of darkness. So is that true or not?
Yes and no. So again, talking about the huge size of Alaska, where I live, South Central, we now know what that means. There, you can see here, June 21, which is solstice, our longest day of the year. We have close to 19 hours of daylight. And that includes these things called, twilight, like the civic twilight and that kind of thing. That thing where the sun sets and it's still light for a little bit after, and then it's light a little bit before the sun rises. So that gives us some extra time there. I have spent quite a bit of time camping around June 21, and I will tell you, it feels like it doesn't get dark when you're actually, in a tent and in the elements. It's a crazy time of year.
Can you sleep?
It can be difficult. You have to remind yourself and your friends to stop. I used to get really worried about like bedtime for my children around that time. And now we're going to be up till midnight on solstice. It's without, a doubt that will happen. And we just try to embrace it. I've learned not to schedule meetings for the day after too early in the morning, because it's always going to be a late night.
No, of course.
Yeah.
So what about the contrast? What about the pitch dark days that you have over there?
Yeah, we are heading into the dark time now, right? And 5 hours, one I remember is 5 hours and 55 minutes. This year, it looks like we're going to have 6 hours and 5 minutes will be our shortest day. The one thing I can say, and I guess this kind of talked me into living here when we were deciding. I grew up in Michigan, and anyone who's in, Minnesota, Michigan, the northern parts of the lower 48 probably can attest to this, that you go to school or work in the dark in the morning, and when you come home 5-something o'clock or after, it is dark. The same thing is true here, only we're talking more like 10 o'clock when that sun is coming up, and 4 o'clock when it's getting dark. And it adds up. It's a tougher time of year for sure.
And for like how much time in winter do you have those like shorter days?
Well, that's where we need to go next, right? With equinox and solstice, for folks to understand. So we do celebrate equinox here, and that is September 21 is the one that we celebrate. We have an incredible artist, Mavis Muller, who does this thing called Burning Basket. I will tell you, without a doubt, the night of Burning Basket, it will be raining, probably sideways, and it will be cold. And that is just, it just seems like that always happens. That first super cold fall time when you're like, oh, you know, get your coats, get your raincoats, even if you're just walking out to the car. It must be time for equinox. And this is just a celebration for our community. We all get together on the beach and burn this big basket. It's a beautiful time for sure.
And it's something very interesting because I think in different cultures, everybody kind of celebrates equinox. And like here in Mexico, also for the Mayans, for example, it was a big thing. So across the world, we're celebrating this. But why? You know, it's something that why do we have equinox? Why do we have solstice? So if we go a little bit technical in this information, we have to first just look at the name. You know, the equinox, and basically what it means is that you're going to have the same amount of daylight and nighttime. Okay, so exactly like half. You know, that's why nox, nocturnal, equi, the same. You know, and what's going to happen is that remember that we have the tilt of the Earth. You know, that is tilted a little bit to one side, and because of that, we have seasons. You know, that's very, very important. So this time of the year that we just passed, actually, the Earth is not that much tilted actually. So the sun, what's going to happen, the rays are going to hit from the equator north or the equator south in the same direction. And when in the other side, they're going to have the opposite, right? So same daylight, same dark night. But then what's going to happen when we have the solstice? So we are going into winter, right? And remember the tilt of the Earth, so it's a little bit to one side. So basically what happens here is that the sun is going to reach its maximum or minimum declination, okay? So we have the equator here. In the southern part, we're going to have the maximum in this part, and in the northern, the minimum. So that's why we're going to have the longest and the shortest days. So this is like, for me, this is the technical information that I've studied, that I know about it, but I don't know really how, you know, important it is for some people, or what are the implications of this. So please, could you explain this?
This is, as I mentioned, you have to remind yourself to stop in the day. It might be 10 o'clock at night and there's no outside thing that is saying you should go in for the evening, right? You can't tell from where the sun is. In that sense, it's almost disorienting. The plants love it. We have huge, whether it's your gardening or it's just plants that are growing, that you can, like weeds in your garden, you could go out and weed the garden and it seems like the very next day they're like this tall. Now I'm sure that's a little dramatized, but they grow so fast during this time, and simply because they have almost 24 hours of daylight. So Alaska has these huge vegetables. They're real, they're not myths. And we do celebrate them at the Alaska State Fair. It's been less of a celebration since COVID, but it does happen. I'm always curious. I have not ever gotten to eat one of these incredibly large vegetables, and I always wonder if they're kind of like fish. They're not necessarily better tasting when they're bigger, but that would be something to try out sometime for sure.
Totally. And so these huge vegetables, like I would assume then that they grow them a little bit more to the northern part of Alaska, so it's not like everywhere.
There's a place called the Matsu Valley, and then also even up into Fairbanks, they would have some of this because that's where that extra long time. And then in Fairbanks, you think you have this combination, right? You have tons of light and very warm weather. However, you also have that permafrost. So the Matsu, which is a little bit farther south from Fairbanks, is kind of this famous area for having great farming in our state. So I think quite a few of them do come from that region.
That's very interesting, because if I was thinking again, like, you know, about maybe those misconceptions, if I'm thinking about Alaska, I'm not thinking about farming, but now I know that, yeah, that also happens up there.
There you go.
And okay, so I know that you are very far north, and something that I really wanted to see always is the auroras. So can you see them everywhere in Alaska? Do you have some areas that you can or that you cannot? So how does that work?
Well, partially folks probably need to watch one of the Aurora webinars to get the whole story on this, but the answer is yes and no. I guess I'm giving those for a lot of these. There is something called the Van Allen belt, and that has to do with the geomagnetic kind of attraction of the Earth from those particles that are coming from the sun that create what we know of as the aurora. You can see on the map here on the left that we're not actually here in Homer, we're not in that sort of hyperactivity belt, if you will, called the Van Allen belt. In Churchill, on the right side of the map, you can see that Churchill is right in that area. And so it's a little bit farther to the left side of Hudson Bay there. And that is where we can really sort of go and depend on seeing lights. However, we have things called geomagnetic storms. And when those storms happen, you know, you've probably heard about this where they'll say like, people are seeing the northern lights all the way down in Texas. We just had last week incredible geomagnetic activity, and we did see beautiful lights here in Homer, but it takes that extra surge for us to really see quite a bit of them, like you see in the photos above. So they happen, but not nearly as much as they do in places like Churchill.
Okay, but you do have other spectacles at night, right?
Well, we've got to make it through the long, dark winter. Some people call it DVD season. I suppose now it would be some streaming service instead of DVDs, but it's dark for a long time, and you have to sort of get okay with that and also learn to keep going and keep doing things even though it's dark. One of the things my mom talks about when she comes to visit, if she's here on the 4th of July, we do not have fireworks, and that's because it's not dark. And so nobody would see the fireworks if we had them on the 4th of July, our Independence Day. So some people will still light off like some noisy things to celebrate. We have other ways of celebrating the 4th of July. But New Year's Eve, that is when our fireworks happen. That's what this photo is from. That's when we really get to celebrate. And then we also find fun things to do. This is my son playing with some photography things and long exposures. This picture was actually taken a little bit after like 5 or so in the evening. So it's about to get dark, and we just went out to play, and you have to do that. You have to embrace it. We have a night ski that happens every year. We have tiki torches lighting the ski paths, and you learn to embrace it basically to get through it.
You have to, I think. And I mean, we've been talking about the regions, and then some part they are very close to, or they are part now of the Arctic Circle. But it was very interesting for me to know that like just one part of Alaska is in the Arctic Circle. For me, it was always like the whole state, is up there. So talking about like latitude, how does that work, and where does it start, the Arctic Circle? Where does it end?
Okay, so that's a great question, because we do throw that word around, right? The Arctic. And yeah. I think a lot of times when we say that, like, what does that really mean? If you've heard me talk before, you know that I think the best definition of the Arctic is simply to figure out where polar bears live. And you're going to have a good sense of what is really an Arctic ecosystem. There are ways to define it, though. 66 degrees north, that's the latitude that is technically the Arctic Circle, anything inside of that, right? But there's places that are quite far north that don't seem like Arctic places. Norway, Sweden, and Finland, they have lots of trees. You go over to Canada, 59 degrees, which is similar here to Homer. Churchill is 59 degrees. So it's quite far from the Arctic, but there's polar bears, there's tundra, there's cold, cold, cold temperatures in the winter. There's also something called an isotherm, which can be used to define the Arctic, which is solely based on temperatures, but those kind of get thrown out too when you have places like the interior of Alaska that do get really warm in the wintertime. So the line itself, I do think we need to have a webinar on latitudes, because it's not a straight thing that one latitude of 59 degrees north, say like Homer, is going to be the same ecosystem at another place. There's so many other variables that come into play. So yeah, we're not even in the subarctic here. We're boreal forest edging on rainforest here in Homer.
Okay, and if now we've been talking about the wildlife that is associated with Alaska and around even the Arctic Circle. Just going back a little bit to these bears that I think down here again we're thinking about Alaska and bears. What do they do? Where can we see them? These beautiful animals.
So we have many different bears in Alaska. We have brown bears, polar bears, and black bears, one of the only places that you can have all of those.
Okay.
And they really do have to be quite adaptable to be able to live here. Polar bears are going to migrate. Brown bears are going to get tons of fat on their body. So let's look at what these animals do to survive. Yeah, migrate or die.
What do you have to do? And I think this is a perfect example of for example, here we see a beautiful humpback whale, and they have to, right? They have to move around, and where are they going? Well, we have them here in the Baja Peninsula. So it's very interesting how different species are going to either move, or if they stay, they have to adapt their body basically to deal with winter, because winter is coming. So if we talk about some birds, okay, some shorebirds that we have all the way north here in Alaska, it's so interesting how we kind of share some of this wildlife. You see them in Alaska, and then we see them here in Baja. So these shorebirds, they have different pathways that they're going to follow depending where they are in the north. So for example, here, they're coming all the way down here. So as Annie is coming for winter, also humpback whales are coming, also shorebirds are coming, which I think it's very interesting. And can you see shorebirds in Homer? I was just wondering.
Yeah, we have an incredible Shorebird Festival that happens in the spring because there are so many birds that are coming from the high Arctic, or in that case, they're coming from down south and they're flying through the Homer area to get to the far Arctic. And I think this is a good point here: migrate, adapt, or die. Like, what are you gonna do to survive?
Yeah.
How are you gonna deal with this? Migrating or adapting, right? They both take enormous amounts of energy. I always am amazed that animals came up with the best plan is to fly or travel thousands of miles. You know that it must be pretty hard to adapt and stay if that long of a migration is a good plan. Some animals do that though, like this eagle here.
And it's I've been learning about these different adaptations that these animals have to go through, and in particular with the eagles. I mean, the first thing they have to do is go sedentary, right? Not move, because you have to be very very useful about the energy that you have, right? Also, something that is very important for them is their feathers. They're going to fluff their feathers. You're going to see them, fluffing, because you're going to create this layer of air, basically, that is going to isolate them from the exterior that it's going super cold. Something that is very interesting that I learned is gorging. Sometimes we do that even as humans. You didn't have breakfast or lunch or dinner, and then the first thing you see, you eat it as much as you can. And this is happening because there's not that much for them to eat. So whenever something is available, off they go and they eat as much as they can. Something else that happens is they're going to find a particular microclimate that most of the time for this particular species is going to be in the trees. So in that area, in particular in the conifer tree, there's going to be a microclimate that is less cold than in other parts, above or under. So they're going to stay around that particular area. And something that actually other species of birds or animals do in general, they're going to slow their metabolic rates. They're going to lower their body temperature again, because it has to be energy costly, right, to endure this cold winter. And can you see them? You know, these eagles going through you know, all of these changes. Can you see them in Homer, or what is, you know, your relationship with these beautiful eagles down there?
That's a great question because we have a ton of eagles here. I don't have the exact number, but I mean, it's not odd for me to see 3 or 4 in a day, just even if I were to be like in my home area. Certainly if we head down to the beach here, I very rarely would say I'm going to guarantee you're going to see wildlife, but I think it would be a safe one. What we see them doing is really what you're saying here. You'll see them sort of like almost, they're not frozen, right? But they're just very still. You can tell that they're conserving energy.
Okay.
They also are opportunistic to the nth degree. So really, while we think of these birds with this grandeur, they love trash. They know they love leftovers. So if something dies on the beach, there are going to be probably an eagle or two who are sort of protecting that and working that area. It's always the intertidal zone that offers a pretty good buffet of food. But yeah, I mean, they're going to get whatever they can get their hands on. In some years, we have things like, you know, a bloom of things like snowshoe hares, and then that will be the food that they will go after. Even songbirds, which is a negative part of having as many eagles in this area. So yeah, they will go through all kinds of shifts in order to survive, as we all will, right?
Totally. And again, with different species, different adaptations, and bears, I think they're famous. You know, they're finding a beautiful place to go into a torpor. So basically, this means, again, like as the eagle, the heart rate is going to decrease, the breathing is going to decrease, and if something happens, they can come out, you know, and defend its den if they need to. If not, they can continue, you know, in this state, you know, of basically just trying to pass their winter. And I remember hearing from you that sometimes around Homer you can see the bears also.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because this time of year is actually the only time of year that I feel any kind of worry about bears. And I mean, I'm not like, you know, frantically here worrying my life away, but when we go for, say, hikes, or my son mountain bikes in the middle of the summer, of course, he has to be aware of bear safety, but pretty much bears are going to have plenty of food. They don't care about what we're doing. This time of year, if they didn't gain enough weight over the summer, you know, the fish have stopped running. The berries are probably kind of done now too. They're going to be looking for other food sources until it's cold, that they get that cold message to hibernate. So we do have more bears in town. Again, back to that, you know, those Facebook communications, that there's all kinds of neighborhood watches, right? That people form those little groups. And ours will constantly have like, hey, there's 2 bears out East End Road, 2 brown bears even were the other day. A mom and some cubs were seen in another area. So it's normal. And this is the time of year when I do not want to deal with a bear, even more so in the spring. So when they have spent that long winter hibernating, they've done this great job maybe of gaining all this weight over these summer months. They've eaten all the fish they can eat. They're eating all the berries and grubs and all those other things. And then they have to go months with no food. So when those bears come out of hibernation in the spring, I do not want to meet one on a trail. I'll know what to do if I do meet one, but I don't want to. Whole different story when we get to the bears we're watching during the summer.
And I think this is a very valid question. This is a question that my nephew, he's 6, he had, because I was, you know, I was telling him about bears, and he was like, okay, so if people live very close to areas where you can see bears, and like if I want to see bears, and just like right out of the blue, he was like, is the bear going to eat me if I see it? Like, am I safe? Is it safe for children to go and see them?
That is a great question for Nico, and I appreciate it because it's honest, right? When I think we get 2 very strong messages about bears in our culture. It's interesting, you can tell me if you have this in Mexico too. There's the whole teddy bear thing, and you know, the bear as your friend and this soft creature that you could talk to and engage with. Many children's books have bears talking, Winnie the Pooh being, of course, like the most famous, right? And then there's unfortunately this sort of monster that is in maybe movies, or I have to be honest, even many documentaries about bears really over dramatize the sort of fierce, you know, side of a bear. We all see those pictures with like the claws and their mouth and whatnot. And really it comes down to us and how we behave around them. So my answer for Nico would be, if you behave in the way that we see this group here, this is from our grizzly chip and our guide Drew Hamilton with a group of guests. They're very close to this bear, and there's probably even more bears in this, you know, the proximity of this group that we can't see in this image, and they're perfectly safe. And that's because they're gonna behave in a predictable manner. The bear has plenty of food, the fish are running, so the bear doesn't care about the food source. But these guys, you can see they're gonna be in a group, they're gonna sit, they're gonna be calm, no big movements. And those are the things that are gonna keep people safe and able to really interact very closely with these, you know, some people call them the gorillas of North America. They're incredibly intelligent. They're so beautiful. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things you can experience in your whole life, is to be so close to this absolutely amazing animal. But you got to do it right.
Yes. And I was wondering, like, maybe because of, you know, the angle of the photo, like what would be the distance in this photo from where the guests are standing, from the distance between the bear and the guest?
I mean, it can be as close as, you know, 10 yards or so, 10 meters roughly, right? We try not to get too close, but I've had them walk just a few feet from me, where our group is staying still and the bear is on its pathway. Again, that bear is choosing that route. It's not us going closer and closer to the bear, but the bear is using that route. I mean, there's definitely times when you're so close. As the bear guide, you don't love those moments that much, but you also know that you've taught everybody in that group that you're gonna behave in a certain way, and then the bears can predict that.
Okay. Going back a little bit to the adaptations of other animals during winter, this animal, I find it very interesting because this is an animal that we don't have in Mexico. The first time I saw marmot was this past April in Colorado, actually, and I was like freaking out, and everybody was like, yeah, marmots, we have them, you know, here. And I was wondering, like, what do they do, you know? And of course, the first thing, and for a lot of species is around the same, accumulate a thick fat of layer. Whales, that are the things that I work with, they do the same thing, you know, they're quite chubby, a very thick fat of layers, so they are isolated from their environment. They do something that I found very interesting, that it was communal hibernation. So it's not just one in its dens, others, and then they are sharing their heat, you know, it's been shared in that way, in that particular area. And because they are all together in one particular den, what they have to do is then tolerate high levels of CO2 that they are breathing out. So I think I found this very, very interesting. And because of that, of course, they are all enclosed, a lot of CO2 coming out, and just a little bit of O2 levels for them. So very interesting physiological adaptations that these animals have to endure. And another one that I found very interesting, and I think moose, this is a species that you can see, you know, everywhere. I've been very lucky enough to see them also, because in Mexico, of course, we don't have moose. But in Colorado, I was lucky enough also to see some of these animals. And for me, the first thing, of course, is to eat, right? We'll be talking about this. They have to eat a lot. They have to not move that much, reduce their movement. They have to conserve energy. And something that it was very unique is that they're going to stay in clear areas or some packed trails for them to conserve energy, where it's easier for them to kind of move around. They have a lot of fur that is thick. It's going to trap air, a little bit similar as with the eagles or with other birds. Also, you know, they have this like big nose, nostril area, and they have these nasal passages that are quite long, and the heat is going to be a little bit warm before it enters their lungs, so they are not breathing cold air. So this is another interesting adaptation. And the last one would be that they are not growing their antlers in winter. And with these amazing animals, I've been hearing that also in Alaska, you can see them maybe outside of your house or on our way to school, or is that true?
That is definitely true. And actually, there's a couple of things with that. You know, we were going to do this presentation originally a couple weeks ago, and there's a storm here and I wasn't able to present. But what was interesting is the night before we were going to do that, I had 2 moose in my front yard that were trying to mate. My children were getting quite the science lesson. But it was fascinating to be able to watch them, you know, move around and how the female reacted to the male. I've had calves born in our yard.
Wow.
And we were home and got to watch it. We were running from room to room with the camera and taking, it was so beautiful. It was so amazing. And just to see the things that you teach about, right? Like the biggest being that they're ready to walk within, I swear they're born ready to walk. Like within minutes, they are up from being born. And to be able to witness that in your own yard is a phenomenal treat. We had to put this in. We're not trying to advertise any certain restaurant, of course, but even when you're going through a drive-through, this is something that you might see. They don't care where they're, you know, where they're around. This is a big bull. This is a photo by a friend of mine, Max, and he was willing to share this with me. Hi, Max, if you're watching. I think he's actually heading to Churchill soon. This moose, it's incredible because this is a big bull. That's quite a rack. And that's not always what we see right in town. We'll often see the moms or the young ones, the calves. But this one, I mean, that's a gorgeous rack there. So and what is amazing to me when I see those racks is that they grow that in like one summer season, right? Like that's a yearly thing to grow that. And that looks like an amazing amount of energy to go into this thing that's going to fall off.
Yeah. They're very impressive, and hopefully soon in the future I can go to Alaska and I can visit you, and then I'll continue, you know, my my stories and learning about these amazing animals and being there with you, and endurance, maybe winter. You know, I think I might be ready for that.
I think you are. I've got the clothes to lend you, so you're okay in the gear department.
Well, Annie, thank you very much for answering my questions, answering some of my mom and nephew and family questions that we have about Alaska. And thank you everybody also, you know, for being here and for listening to us. So I'm going back to Annie.
Okay, well, Sofia, I think sometime you should let me ask you questions about Mexico. I think that would be really fun. So we might have to do the north ponders the south, and we'll see, like, do you eat tacos only all the time? Because I think if I lived in Mexico, that's what I would do. So I have a lot of questions for you. We also have a few more images here, and we are totally ready, Sunny, to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions about what it's like to live in Alaska or Mexico for that matter.
Sounds good. Before we start the Q&A, I want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the questions field in the control panel. So let's start right off with a bear question. Do black bears compete with brown bears for salmon?
Oh, that's such a good question. I love whoever asked that. Thank you so much. I am forever fascinated between the zones of black bears and brown bears. And typically, if I were to look at a map of the area, say across the bay from where I live, which would be Kachemak Bay State Park, there's areas that end up being sort of brown bear habitat, and there's areas that end up being black bear habitat. as I say that, the habitats aren't different. It's like the zones that they've sort of established. I don't want to use the word territory because bears don't quite have territory the way that other animals do. So they do get sort of their zones. There is a place called Annan Creek, which is actually where that little black bear cub that we saw the picture of the black bear cub from the southeast. That is a photo from Annan Creek, and there you can watch black bears and brown bears feed in the same place at the same river. My experience at Annan Creek was that the black bears were a little bit more dominant, which is different than what you might expect, and the brown bears sort of had to sneak in, get what they needed, and get away, whereas there was many black bears in the stream. That could have just been those couple of days. I've not spent enough time there to feel that I can really speak to, you know, what happens big picture. But what I saw, the black bears were ruling Annan Creek and some brown bears were coming in. In general, there'll be a few miles where there will be, this is black bear territory. There'll be a few miles where there's brown bear. And that's not to say it's checkered, but they sort of stick with those areas. I'm always really interested in how those areas start to shift. So I'm kind of constantly hearing from Fish and Game and trying to learn about, like, they'll sort of start to see an area becoming maybe more brown bear or more black bear. And I'm fascinated by what makes that happen. Is it a few dominant bears that are pushing the edges? I don't know. It's something that I'm kind of constantly learning about.
Well, with that, piggybacking on that topic and talking about the ranges of bears shifting, what can you say about the range of polar bears shifting into regions with black bears and grizzly bears, and the interbreeding? What is the latest status on that? What have you experienced?
It's a great question. First off, take black bears out of that scenario completely. There really are not black bears that are kind of in that scenario that we've heard about with the brown bear or grizzly bear and polar bear hybrids. That's been in the news a lot. And what it really comes down to is there's an area in northern Canada, not near Churchill. It's like, I believe it's Banff Island, but I'd have to double check that. And there's one grizzly female that ends up, one polar bear female that ends up mating with grizzly bears. And her young and their young have continued that pattern, but it is not happening from what we know throughout the Arctic. Now, that doesn't mean that brown bear and polar bear territory is not overlapping quite a bit. And what we are seeing here in Alaska is the barren ground grizzlies, when they do get near that polar bear territory, right? Polar bears didn't used to be on land all the time. That's why this is happening. The ice is melted. The polar bears are forced onto land. This is the land where the grizzlies are used to hanging out. And incredibly small grizzlies compared to the size of the polar bear can push a polar bear off of a food source. And that's just interesting to think, like, why can this little sort of, aggressive bear, why can they kick off a larger bear? And I've thought about this a lot, and you know what it is? Polar bears don't have any competition out on the ice. There's really not another animal besides another polar bear, and they're used to sorting out that scenario, but there's really not other animals. Whereas, you go to Yellowstone and you've got grizzlies on a kill with wolves trying to get in, and all kinds of animals that are going to be competing for that food opportunity. Polar bears don't have to deal with that. So I think the second they see these little aggressive grizzlies, they're like, oh, I don't know what to do, and they run. So it's just humorous that way. But yeah, as far as the hybrids go, it's one female who's like to mate with grizzlies.
So here's a very specific question. What is the giant fish next to your child? You showed a picture.
Sure.
I wonder if you can identify it.
Yep, that's a halibut, and that we just thought was so funny because she caught a fish she had help obviously, but she caught a fish that was as big as her. Back in the day, halibut could get to be, I think the record is like 14, I don't want to say the number because I feel like I might be wrong. Hundreds and hundreds of pounds are what these fish could get to. They're bottom feeders. A lot of people have probably eaten halibut. Certainly if you come to Alaska and, you know, go out to eat and you do enjoy eating fish, then halibut would probably be a great one to experience. And it's one that we do try to catch some here in the summer so we can stock up for the winter. Groceries are incredibly expensive. That's kind of a topic we didn't get into today as far as stereotypes of Alaska, but man, I saw someone post the other day an expensive sandwich from the Churchill grocery store, and I was like, yep, that's what it would cost here too. So we do have to pay attention to gathering our protein because it makes a lot more sense to gather it here than ship it from the lower 48.
So here's an interesting question. What is your thought, or what are your thoughts on the demonization of bears and other wildlife in movies and documentaries?
I think that's a great question. I, you know, in fiction, it makes me a little sad to see bears overrepresented as these, yeah, demon, as you would say, or a monster. In fiction, though, it bothers me far less than when I see it in things that are trying to come off as, you know, a documentary, as a true representation. Because, well, of course, bear attacks, they do happen. The first question I'll ask every single time when someone says, did you hear about the bear attack that happened? Fill in the blank. I will always ask, was that person running? Because many times when we read the story, it doesn't make them less tragic or sad, but many times, sure enough, it was someone who was running through the forest. And what we know is that if we move slowly, let bears know we're in the area, that, you know, we can be around them safely. With that said, I bet people would not be able to guess which bear I think is the scariest. Not the polar bear, it's not the grizzly bear, it is the black bear. The only bear that has been actually seen to hunt or to like spend days stalking people is a black bear. Every other situation where you have an attack, it's like I said, there's a run, someone's running, someone's moving quickly, it's a happenstance, an unfortunate one that happens very quickly. Neither the bear or the human were prepared for it. There's black bear stories where people say, yeah, that bear was around camp for like 3 or 4 days. And it's like, that 3 or 4 days in is the sign to do something about that situation. I think it's really sad that they're demonized, along with wolves, right? Going back from the Little House on the Prairie books, and these wolves being the sort of, they become the image of wilderness being awful, which I think gives us a right to destroy that wilderness. And that's the real danger of that demonization, because we need wilderness to survive. It is not what we should be destroying.
I think it's the same with sharks, right? Like going through a little bit to the ocean part is the same, you know, we've been demonizing for a long time. I think movies like Jaws, they don't help, you know, in that way, because that makes us like be very not attached to them, like, you know, put a big barrier to them and be like, I don't care if something is happening to them because they are dangerous, you know. So I don't think it helps a lot. And yeah.
If you want to make something scary, make a moose scary. They're far more scary to me than the bears that we have, because they're not predictable. So yeah, we should do a whole webinar on that one too.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we have time for right now. Thank you so much for that presentation. I found it extremely fun and interesting to listen to. I'm going to turn it over to you and for any closing comments.
Well, thank you very much for tuning in on this Friday. We had lots of fun preparing and working for this particular presentation, so hopefully that got transmitted also to everyone that is listening. And thank you, Annie, also for, you know, for the great conversation, and you know, I've learned so much about your place now, so I'm very happy that we did this together.
Sophia, I think you're ready to come guide in Alaska. You nailed all the science on those animals. I loved learning it from that perspective. Thank you everyone who joined us. We love that we get to talk about wildlife and ecosystems and natural history with all of you. It is why we do what we do. Next week, I will be back to my regular day, which is Thursday, and we're going to be talking about the smaller things and how to not overlook the wonderful things in wilderness and in nature that are small. So thank you so much. And Sunny, thanks for helping us put this together. We couldn't do it without you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in. Please join us on Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup or next week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.